So friends, in the second part of the discussion, we become specific with respect to the production of Indian writing in English in the 19th century. And there might be aspects, like social aspects, and things were happening, at the level of imagination also. So imagination and society entering into a common domain, and education defines and society puts pressure on it. That is the dialectic that might be kept in mind to discuss further the specific points of the Indian writing in English with respect to the 19th century ethos. So I request Dr. Richa Bajaj, to go further into the domain and tell us more about the process that produced Indian writing in English, specifically in the modern context in the 19th century.
In my previous lecture, I spoke to you about the advent of English and what English had done. Now, I want to move to both the two other words in the title. They are both literature and Indian, right? We've discussed English earlier, but now we'll move on to discuss what constitutes the other terms. Now, as just a reference, you might want to look at what Meenakshi Mukherjee says in her book, on Indian literature, which is of course to do with the novel, and she talks about realism and reality. That's the title of the book, The Novel and Society in India. Now, Meenakshi Mukherjee initially, she begins by talking about English education, and the through English and exposure to Western literature was a very important influence, and that's how she talks about it. And she says it is not an accident that the first crop of novels in India in Bengali and Marathi appeared exactly a generation after Macaulay's Educational Minutes, making English a necessary part of educated Indians' mental makeup, right? So she says that this is something which happened simultaneously. Again, she says that a whole new world became available to educated Indians in the middle of the 19th century through their study of English literature. So again, exposure to the world outside, educated Indians in the middle of the century, in the 19th century, are now reading works from different parts of the world. She says, and I quote, "The society represented in the novels of Scott, Dickens and Thackeray was very different from the society Indians knew and lived in, which in turn was already different from the traditional agrarian life of previous generations, which had been the stable cultural background, a background which the extension of British rule had partially disrupted." Unquote. So, note another interesting thing that happens in the 19th century. One, that the society that educated Indian writers or thinkers witness in the West, say in the worlds of Scott, Dickens and Thackeray, that society is very different from what Indians are used to or knew. Obviously, we are also looking at a pre-industrial Indian situation, and 19th century in England was just ridden with all sorts of industrial problems of industrializations, which you see in Dickens very clearly. So that reality on one hand was not the Indian reality, and on the other hand the traditional agrarian life of previous generations, which writers had been writing about, or that was the main cultural sort of foundation of a lot of literature written in India, that was also disrupted because of the extension of British rule. So the Britishers actually brought in a kind of a disruption between the previous kind of agrarian life and a new kind of life that writers now saw. So neither was their own background helping them in creating a world in literature, nor the world of the West. So in a way, this was a moment of, this is why I also call it the moment of shift. And this is also the moment when new kind of writing emerges, because there's already a kind of a severance from the past and a kind of a severing of ties, and also the new is not yet available, in that sense. So in that sense, you find that Indian literature found itself in a kind of a warp or a void, where the old did not suffice and the new had as yet not taken shape. How would you comment on this?
No, this is the important point in history, in the history of writing, in the history of literary communication. And one important thing that you mentioned in passing was that the argument occurs, in a book on novel, and there is nothing like a novel in the 19th century India.
Right.
And this novel was all the three words, all the three names were Scott and Dickens and Thackeray. All these are now novelists.
Right.
And what is a novel? The Indian reader in the 19th century just won't understand the term.
Exactly, yeah.
Because novel means that there has to be a narrative, things start from somewhere, they go somewhere, and in the middle of it the society is seen, and this longish narrative is passed on from one reader to another.
Right.
So earlier we had plays, which would be quite long, but nothing like a novel which can be read in 10 days or 20 days or sometimes.
So it was being experimented in the 19th century in Bengal, say with Bankim Chandra and all.
Yes,
right?
yes.
So this kind of experimentation, or you can say Umrao Janada as an example of 19th century novel. So
yes.
these are just stray examples, or we had travelogues before that. So in a way, there were travel writings that existed
of the Western people here.
Also of Indians who had gone abroad.
There would be some maybe.
Yeah, there is the travelogues of Muhammad Deen, who goes abroad and then comes back and writes. So these kind of travelogues or travel writing, is there, but these are of course not the norm, and novel as such has not taken its shape, in the 19th century as it would in the 20th century. So just the sort of, but again, this was just to connect how English in a way, or exposure to English novel, helped people understand, or helped the educated Indian understand a new kind of writing that was emerging on the scene. By the close of the 19th century, the short story had also begun to take shape, in the form of, and Premchand very soon would take the field, take it up in the early 20th century, at least in Hindi literatures. So, and other places also you have Indulekha, etc., right? So I think that the narrative also is also becoming a new genre to deal with for Indian writers, right? So and this I think has to do a lot with English, advent of English, again, as I mentioned in my previous lecture. But in this one, I want to discuss the other category of this title, which is the word Indian itself, and what constitutes Indian. And in this context, I find A.K. Ramanujan's essay, Is There an Indian Way of Thinking, an informal essay, useful to discuss. So if you look at the screens, you'll be able to see that this is what A.K. Ramanujan points out. He takes at least 4 ways in which you can interpret this entire title of his essay, and the title of the essay is There an Indian Way of Thinking? Now, if you notice, in the first case, he emphasizes, he's italicized the word is. So he takes that question, is there an Indian way of thinking? The second case emphasizes an, which is there an Indian way of thinking? The third question, the same question, is now focused on the word Indian. So it says, is there an Indian way of thinking? And the fourth one emphasizes the word thinking itself. Is there an Indian way of thinking? Right? So in each case, you notice that he has turned attention towards one or another word. And it's an interesting contribution to the way we look at these categories. Now, the first question, Ramanujan says there was maybe an Indian way of thinking earlier, but with the 20th century case of migration and cityscapes coming up, there isn't any more. He says that there was an Indian way. Now we've become more cosmopolitans, more city people. So in a way, it has lost that kind of Indianness that we spoke of. So he says there was maybe an Indian way of thinking, but in the present context, he says there isn't, right? But then he problematizes it, because in the second question, he says, he says that it is difficult to talk about an Indian way of thinking, right, or an Indian tradition, which means any singular Indian tradition. He says that it is difficult to pin it to any unified single sensibility called India, because India has had so many traditions, it has got great traditions and little traditions. There are so many parallel movements that have taken place in India. There's been the classical and the folk traditions of writing. There is ancient and the modern, right, and there is rural and the urban. So all these are categories that will not give you the answer to an Indian way of thinking, So if you think of India, you do not think of a unified sensibility. Of course, you can think of it as unity in diversity, but the diversity in itself is its strength, but also restricts a kind of homogeneous definition of what we might call Indian. In fact, other categories such as the region that this writing is belongs to, the caste groups or languages that are that make this country that give its diversity. These are the things that will always disable a kind of an Indian way of, or any specific point of view, right?
What would be Indian in the case that it's about the region, it's about the Indian languages, it's about the Indian life. I think that is our main concern today, and I would feel that Indianness is yet to be defined in precise terms. Even though this person says that there's nothing like Indian today, it's cosmopolitan, because back to square one, we have the struggle to evolve a kind of Indianness that may or may not have been there in the 19th century.
Right. Also because this sense of Indianness emerges with a kind of nationalism that came to the fore. The sense of Indian identity also reached its peak during the period of nationalism. But what is interesting here is that when we say that, what I find interesting is that the narratives that work very well for any country to unify a particular country, patriotism, when we say it, they are defined or they are based on two very important factors: religion and language. For instance, you take any other country, whether it was America or it is England, when they fight, then they somehow all come together because they have one religion. Right? They come together because they speak the same language. In India, it doesn't hold at all, because you have so many languages and you have so many religions work it simultaneously. So the things that you can call people up for, and things that unify a nation, language and religion, they are basically missing in the case of India. So in a way, the Indianness that came to the fore because of the national movement, because of the fight against a common enemy that was the imperialistic British regime, and it was that which led to this kind of unity. So in our case, the religion probably would become the constitution, because that is something that everybody abides by. Because to think of it, none of us can agree to on the same point when it comes to religion or language, but all of us abide by the constitution of the country because we've had a shared history. So I think the shared history becomes the point of unity in India. The shared sort of history of colonization, of facing injustices, of building a nation, of imagining a nation along lines, or that would be democratic and that would think of all. So this is how I look at it. What do you think?
No, you see, I think one can't disagree with this. In the 19th century, there is nothing like India, the way we understand the term in the early 20th century. And India becomes one because, as you rightly say, that there is a common enemy. And that enemy is not English, or the enemy is not religion, etc. The enemy is English imperialism. And when you realize in your own life, writing poems, writing plays, writing novels, you realize that social life is changing under the impact of imperialist restrictions. And those restrictions, if they come to the fore, then you start throwing away those restrictions and fighting against them and struggling, and in the struggle you get together to fight the common enemy. So nationalism, I think, is the main factor.
So and Ramanujan, to the third question where he says, is there an Indian way of thinking, he says in fact some people have look at it and he's just putting in different points of views, and he says the third point of Indianness, again, as we are talking about it, he says that a lot of people look at it as a stage of social development, where you look at India as a kind of a pre-industrial feudal world, like any other society in the 19th century, and therefore it is in a stage of social evolution, and it's not something which is peculiar to India but to any society that is in that phase of Indianness. And then he says that the fourth question of thinking, that is there an Indian way of thinking, right, where the thinking is emphasized. He says that brings up the question of East and West sort of dynamic, and he says that there has been a popular belief that the West is always associated with materialistic scientific enterprise, and it questions the very idea that whether Indians can think at all, right, that Indians probably never thought, and that for Indians had no philosophy, they only had religion, and that Indians have had no scientific thought really, and they believe that for Indians or to India, matter is subordinate to spirit, and that rational thought is also subordinate to feeling. So there is, he says that some people lament and the others celebrate this unthinking ways, as he calls it. So what I'm trying to suggest here is that there is a sense of constant debate around the idea of Indianness, and a constant debate around the idea, this essay actually springs up all the seminal questions that 20th century had to face. What constitutes Indian, right? Again, if you notice, the 20th century writers, they also had to fight their own contemporaries because they were using English as a medium to write. Did they become, and Raja Rao had to write a full manifesto on why he was using English as the language of writing and not writing in the vernacular, because then they were targeted by the people of their own country. So one, they are ill at ease with the language English. Two, they have as yet not developed or found an Indian identity that can be called Indian per se. And three, they have to fight this kind of imperialistic enterprise in the first part of the century till the second. It is only, as you mentioned in the beginning, that it is only in the post-colonial period that the Indianness sort of becomes a kind of a self-aware enterprise, it is not something which is constantly, it may be indebted to the West, but then it has its own base and it understands itself. So I think this awareness of Indianness is something that sets in properly in the post-independence period, precisely.
I think the argument that you present with the help of Ramanujan is that Indianness is now going to be defined by the Indian middle class, by the Indian educated class, which is educated in English, which is open to ideas and impressions and influences from elsewhere, and that they'll talk in different ways and they'll become more and more academic in the process. So I believe that there is a kind of Indianness, and I wouldn't like to ideologically define it, but there is a kind of Indianness which is rooted in Indian economic conditions. And the national movement, as you pointed out, was there because it was anti-imperialistic.
But also Indianness in terms of its culture. Wouldn't you say that? I mean, I feel that, see, what Ramanujan doesn't give any answers per se. He's trying to problematize the entire area, and I think it just helps us, in fact, understand better the kind of dimensions that exist and the kind of popular viewpoints that have existed around the category called Indian. So, in order for us to analyze Indian literatures in English, it's very important to understand, one, the role that English has played in India from 19th century onwards, but also to understand the changing conception and the changing definition of Indian over a period of time from different centuries, from how it was understood in the 19th century, how its meaning changed during the national period, and what it became in the post-colonial period. So the word Indian also, and how it was perceived and understood, that also continuously changes, right?
No, it changes, no doubt, but I believe a kind of liberalist design, in Ramanujan, he doesn't want to give answers, and which means he is also fighting against focus. There should be a focus in your writing, in your argument, and I believe the focus will come when you consider people like Tagore, people like Premchand, people like Muktibodh, people in other languages in India, from Tamil and from Malayalam. All these people, finally reach the conclusion that there is a kind of Indianness which is situated in the Indian land relations, the Indian people, Indian masses, and that their, the family system, also religion in a slightly tangential way, but Indianness is there, rooted in the Indian conditions. So that focus seems to be missing in Ramanujan.
No, see, I'm not contending with Ramanujan at all here.
He raises questions but doesn't answer them.
Yeah. So he raises a lot of questions, and I find them very useful to develop ones. What I find interesting in that kind of an enterprise is that, you can always find your own answers, because it leaves you with so many loose ends, and there are, there are these specifics that one can pick up and build one's own narrative. So I find it very important to to understand India in these different ways. Whether, I mean, for instance, would you agree when he says something like that people have associated, that there is a popular belief that India has no scientific thought, and that India is considers feeling superior to rationality?
No, no, I don't think that is the case at all. In India,
but again, the point is that these questions were becoming important. For instance, even Ezekiel, when he was writing his poetry, for instance, he constantly dealt with the superstition on one hand and rationality on the other. Superstition, which is a part of, say, how Indians have been living over a period of time. Think of the Night of the Scorpion, for instance. You know, how Indians have been living and how the superstition has made them blind, and how rationality needs to find its way in Indian thought. So, at one level, there is this kind of a fight between rationality, scientific thought on one side, and superstition, myth, and tradition that that we have been following on the other. Even U.R. Ananthamurthy had to think of on these lines: what is the job of a writer? What must a writer do, right? In the post independence period or in the post colonial period. So I feel that the problem of the East and the West,
the answer to these questions that these people raise, they are mostly all these people are post Second World War people.
Right.
But in the 19th century, answers were different. I'm coming back to 19th century. Why should have reform movements if there are all these questions? Reform means you have to come back to scientific thought, and you have to come back to logic and all. And reform movements were always critical of blind prejudices that were rampant in the 19th century.
That's true. So, I feel that the post-colonial period tries to build a kind of a comparison between the East and the West, right? But the 19th century, as you rightly mentioned, they had already picked the side of rationality, whether it came from wherever. In fact, they would be critical of the West with their extreme, emphasis on on proof or data or science, right? And they would often mock it for that reason, right? Because the kind of extremes that, for instance, English laws would not take anything that was not proof, and writers would constantly mock, even when the truth is before you, you need science to, or you need a legal system to validate it, or you need proofs to validate it. So, I'm reminded of Premchand's, for instance, Hori Panchayat, where the Panchayat is able to give a kind of a proper decision. I'm thinking of Fakir Mohan Senapati's novel, 6 Acres and a Half, where he talks about the entire British legal system, which he thinks is completely on its own trip, and that they are not able to understand the grassroots reality. So they criticize the West, and yet they are in favor of rationality. So the rational principle for social reformers is an important point, and they are reformed because they are not asking to bring the house down with revolutionary acts. Like, for instance, the social reformers of the early 20th century would say, okay, just increase the marriage of the girl from 10 to 12 years. So, just these small headways that they were making through reforms, they were changing the Indian society. I think in the long run, they paved a very important role in building a system of rationality and secular thought in India in the 19th century. So that is what I feel. But the East-West dichotomy that we speak of is not so relevant or or even important for these writers in the 19th century, because their focus is on changing the mindsets of the people, or getting rid of fossilized sort of belief systems, and creating a space for education and for rational thought. So I think that is what is important in the 19th century. By the time you reach the 20th century and you reach Indian literatures in the early 20th century, then nationalism takes on every literary practice takes up a kind of a national color, whichever side it may come from, whatever kind of nationalism it may be. But most of the early 20th century literature is based on the national, has the national spirit in place, and builds a kind of a dialogue with, how to find inroads and how to create space for this kind of revolution or freedom struggle by bringing the people in, by opening their minds, but at the same time fighting the British, so it is a kind of a dual fight that they have to constantly have. One, opening the minds of the people, creating a space where they become open to new ideas, where they can come together, because India, as it was so divided, one group would not stand with the other, to fight the British, because one didn't belong to the same caste group or some class group, etc. But it was very important for them to realize their own, or see one another as humans before they could fight an external enemy. So I think that is what I feel is very important in the early part of the 20th century.
I would agree with you, and this is the right kind of conclusion for today's discussion, that there is a kind of diversity, there is a kind of ramification in the society at the present time, and that some kind of nationalism is required in order to take care of this kind of diversity, and vice versa. Because if you have the kind of nationality that restricts freedom, then you would like to go in the direction of diversity also. So friends, with these questions that have come up in the discussion by Dr. Richa Bajaj, we have the crux of the series that we are launching today, and I am sure that when we consider different texts and different authors occurring in coming up in the 19th and 20th centuries, and also in the 21st century, then these questions will come and collide with one another in order to make the compulsion of reaching a consensus, and that consensus may come, may not come, but then this will definitely touch our intellectual chords, our discourses, etc., and will be more aware about the problems, as is the case with most of the important literary writing. So thank you, and I think that from this time onwards we will be discussing authors, trends, texts and ideas. Thank you.